Most people assume the Smithsonian Institution exists to preserve America's history, but what if its real purpose was to erase it? In 1823, something was unearthed beneath Philadelphia that would challenge everything we think we know about who built this continent, and then, systematically, it vanished. This isn't about dusty academic debates. This is about physical evidence that existed, was documented, and then disappeared under circumstances that raise deeply uncomfortable questions. The story begins with a construction crew breaking ground for what would become the Mercantile Exchange building on 3rd Street. 14 feet below street level, workers struck something that stopped them cold. Not bedrock, not colonial foundations. Human remains. But these weren't normal. The skeletal structure measured over 8 feet in length, with a skull circumference that exceeded normal human proportions by nearly 40%. The jawbone alone required both hands to hold. The Pennsylvania Gazette documented the find on November 17, 1823, describing bones of extraordinary magnitude, discovered in undisturbed soil layers predating known colonial settlement. Within 3 days, a second skeleton was uncovered, then a third, then 7 more, each exceeding 7.5 feet, each found in positions suggesting deliberate burial, each accompanied by artifacts that didn't match anything in the accepted historical record of the region. Copper armbands with geometric patterns, stone implements too large for average human hands, and something the newspaper accounts mention only once before falling silent: fragments of what appeared to be copper armor. Here's where it gets strange. For 2 weeks, these remains were on public display at the American Philosophical Society building. Hundreds viewed them. Detailed measurements were recorded. Artists created sketches. Then, the newly established Smithsonian Institution, barely 2 years old, sent representatives from Washington. They arrived with federal marshals. They crated everything. And according to shipping manifests preserved in Philadelphia customs records, those crates were transported to Washington on December 8, 1823. They were logged into Smithsonian receiving documentation, and then the paper trail ends. No catalog entries, no research papers, no exhibition records, nothing. It's as if 14 tons of skeletal remains simply evaporated upon arriving at the nation's premier scientific institution, but the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In 1856, workers excavating for a railroad spur in West Philadelphia struck a burial mound. Same story. Skeletons measuring between 7 and 9 feet. Same artifacts. Same geometric copperwork. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran the story on March 22, 1856. Within a week, Smithsonian representatives arrived. Within 2 weeks, everything was gone. No follow-up articles, no scientific publications, just silence. If you're finding this difficult to believe, you're not alone. But before you dismiss it, ask yourself this: why would multiple newspapers risk their credibility publishing fabrications? Why would the American Philosophical Society, founded by Benjamin Franklin himself, allow its reputation to be attached to a hoax? And why would the Smithsonian, if these finds were fraudulent, bother sending federal resources to collect them? The answers to those questions might be more disturbing than the questions themselves. And if you want to understand why this matters beyond historical curiosity, why this connects to everything from the buildings around you to the very timeline you've been taught, make sure you're subscribed. Because what we're about to examine will reframe how you see the entire constructed narrative of American history. The Philadelphia discoveries weren't isolated. That's the critical point. Between 1821 and 1903, newspaper archives document at least 47 separate giant skeleton discoveries across Pennsylvania alone. Harrisburg, 1875. 9-foot skeleton with double row of teeth. Pittsburgh, 1883. 7 skeletons averaging 8 feet, found with advanced copper metallurgy. Allentown, 1891. Burial complex containing 17 oversized remains with sophisticated bronze work that metallurgical analysis later suggested predated known regional metalworking by centuries. Notice the pattern. Each discovery follows the same sequence. Construction unearths remains, local press reports it, scientific institutions express interest, Smithsonian involvement, then evaporation from the historical record. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This isn't sporadic. This is systematic. The Smithsonian's own annual reports from this period contain something revealing. From 1823 to 1906, the phrase "specimens of unusual osteological significance" appears 73 times in procurement logs. But when you cross-reference those entries with catalog numbers, exhibition records, or research publications, you find nothing. 73 acquisitions of unusual osteological significance that generated exactly 0 scholarly output. That's not scientific negligence. That's intentional suppression. But here's where it gets even stranger. In 1894, the Philadelphia Times ran an interview with a Smithsonian curator named Clarence Wolfe, who had been dismissed from his position. He claimed the institution maintained a special vault for problematic specimens that contradict established anthropological timelines. He specifically mentioned pre-Columbian metallurgical work and skeletal remains of extraordinary stature from Pennsylvania excavations. 3 weeks after that interview was published, Wolfe was committed to an asylum. The commitment papers cited delusional fixations regarding institutional conspiracies. He died there in 1897. His claims were never investigated. The silence is deafening, because if Wolfe was fabricating, why commit him? Why not simply refute his claims with evidence? Why not open the collections to independent verification? Unless, of course, verification was precisely what they couldn't risk. The artifacts found with these skeletons deserve particular attention. Contemporary accounts describe copperwork of extraordinary sophistication, featuring precision geometric patterns impossible to achieve without advanced mathematical knowledge. An 1882 article in the Philadelphia Record mentions a copper breastplate found with an 8.5-foot skeleton that displayed machined uniformity, suggesting mechanical production methods. Let that sink in. We're talking about 1882, when metallurgical analysis was advanced enough to recognize machine precision tooling. And they're finding it on artifacts supposedly created by primitive pre-Columbian cultures using stone tools. The cognitive dissonance is intentional. It has to be. Because once you accept that these artifacts are real, that they display technological sophistication beyond what the official timeline allows, everything else collapses. Who were these people? Why were they here? What happened to them? And most importantly, why is there such institutional desperation to prevent us from asking these questions? The buildings themselves whisper the answer. Walk through Philadelphia's old city. Look at the construction. We're told these structures were built by colonial settlers with basic 18th century technology. But the precision stonework, the massive foundation blocks, the architectural features that mirror old-world construction techniques from supposedly isolated cultures, they tell a different story. A story that aligns perfectly with a civilization that possessed advanced metallurgy, sophisticated mathematics, and physical stature that dwarfed modern humans. If you're still with me, still questioning, still willing to examine evidence rather than accept comfortable narratives, subscribe now. Because what comes next connects these Philadelphia skeletons to a global pattern that suggests we're not just missing a chapter of history, we're missing the entire volume. And the institutional forces that destroyed this evidence are the same forces that built the framework of everything you were taught to believe. The implications expand in directions most people aren't prepared to follow. If there was an advanced civilization in North America before Columbus, before the accepted timeline allows, then every assumption about human development, technological progression, and historical causation requires reassessment. The Smithsonian wasn't just hiding bones, it was protecting a narrative that positions European colonial powers as the bringers of civilization to a primitive continent, a narrative that erases indigenous high cultures, a narrative that conceals whoever built the massive earthworks, the sophisticated copperworking cultures, the monumental architecture that exists in layers beneath our modern cities. Philadelphia's giants weren't anomalies, they were remnants of what came before the reset, before the flood, before whatever cataclysmic event scrubbed the continent clean and left only fragments for us to puzzle over. Consider the burial positions. Contemporary accounts consistently describe these skeletons oriented precisely to cardinal directions, with intentional geometric arrangement suggesting astronomical knowledge. That's not primitive burial practice. That's sophisticated cosmological understanding embedded in funerary tradition. The same astronomical alignment principles we find in ancient sites worldwide, almost as if one culture, one civilization spanned the entire globe before recorded history. The copper armor fragments offer another thread. Analysis from an 1889 Philadelphia Academy of Sciences report describes bronze alloy composition inconsistent with known regional copper sources, suggesting either trade networks spanning continental distances or metallurgical knowledge enabling controlled alloy production. Either possibility demolishes accepted historical models. If pre-Columbian North America had continental trade networks advanced enough to source specific mineral compositions, we're looking at sophisticated civilization. If they could manufacture controlled bronze alloys, we're looking at technology that supposedly didn't exist here for another 1,000 years. The Smithsonian chose suppression, not study, not publication, suppression. That choice reveals everything about institutional priorities. Preservation of narrative over pursuit of truth. But here's what they couldn't erase: the newspaper archives, the witness testimonies, the court records from property disputes involving these excavation sites, the private letters from researchers who saw these specimens before they disappeared. The pattern is too big, too distributed, too documented to completely memory hole. What were they so afraid of us discovering? That question matters more than the skeletons themselves. Because the answer determines whether we live in a world where institutions serve truth or serve power, whether science pursues knowledge or protects orthodoxy, whether history is discovered or constructed. The Philadelphia giants force a choice. Either dismiss centuries of documented evidence, eyewitness testimony, and scientific analysis as coordinated fabrication, or accept that something fundamental about our understanding of this continent's history is wrong, intentionally wrong. Most people choose comfort, choose the textbook version, choose not to look at the spaces between what we're told and what the evidence shows. But you're still here, still questioning, which means you've already made your choice. The story doesn't end in 1823. It doesn't end in Philadelphia. It extends through every Smithsonian acquisition of unusual specimens, through every archaeological site mysteriously reclassified and sealed, through every researcher who asked uncomfortable questions and found their funding cut, their reputation destroyed, their evidence vanished. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the question isn't whether this happened. The evidence confirms it happened. The question is, what else are they hiding? What other evidence has been systematically erased to maintain a historical narrative that serves institutional power rather than historical truth? Those questions don't have comfortable answers, but they demand investigation. They demand we look at every official story with the scrutiny it should have received before being codified as fact. They demand we question who benefits from certain histories being told while others are buried 14 feet beneath Philadelphia streets. The giants existed. They were documented. They were destroyed. And somewhere in the Smithsonian's restricted archives, the evidence still exists, waiting for someone brave enough to demand access. Waiting for the moment when suppression becomes impossible, when the truth, however uncomfortable, however reality-shattering, finally emerges. Until then, we have the fragments, the newspaper accounts, the witness testimonies, the patterns that repeat across continents and centuries. And we have a choice: accept what we're told or examine what they're hiding. What else is buried beneath our cities? What other evidence waits in vaults marked problematic? And when the full truth finally emerges, how much of everything we thought we knew will collapse? Those questions don't get answered here. They get explored in the next investigation, because this story isn't finished. It's just beginning.